Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reacting to the results of our Probat versus Typhoon blind taste test video featuring Manhattan coffee roasters. And for anybody unfamiliar with the video I'm referencing, I'll go ahead and include a link to it down below. But the premise of that video was me blind taste testing 28 samples of 14 different coffees, with each coffee roasted on either the Probat or the Typhoon, and me seeing which of the two samples I preferred. And I went into that video with two theories, the first of which being that there would be some noticeable differences between each of the samples, and the second being that I expected coffees roasted on the Probat to be a little bit more vibrant, while coffees roasted on the Typhoon I expected to be a little bit more clean and bright. So I'm going to go through each of these coffees one by one, and at the end of the video I'll give my overall thoughts and reactions to this blind taste test. So we're going to start with the first coffee, which was the Dubernay Cifuentes, a wash-processed Colombian geisha. And I'd actually had this coffee one time before as a pour over at a coffee shop. And this is one of the bigger wins for the Typhoon, as this one did win due to its vibrancy. So that did go against my theory at the start of the video. The Typhoon was a little bit more herbal and citric, but for the most part, this one was a pretty close call. There were some noticeable differences between these two coffees, but as I kind of mentioned, it did go against my initial theory. And one thing I wanted to say was I went back and said at the notes that I didn't necessarily think that this was just a standard wash processed coffee. And a lot of the reason for that is because it is a little bit more vibrant than one might expect for a Colombian geisha. So this one right here, a really nice win for the Typhoon, and it did go against my theory. Next up, we have the Janssen X850 wash processed Panamanian geisha. And this one right here was a win for the Probat, though this one was probably one of the closest calls between any of the coffees that we actually tried in this entire video. They were pretty similar in general, but as mentioned, there was just a slight bit more vibrancy for the Probat version of this coffee. And in that video, I did say immediately upon grinding the coffee and kind of smelling the aroma that I did believe it was one of the Janssen coffees, even though I've never had this particular Janssen. That being said, I've had and reviewed a lot of Janssen coffees on this channel, so I think I had enough familiarity to kind of tell, but this one right here being a really close call, it did align with my theory. Well, we will continue on to coffee number 3, which was the Luna Bermudez Advanced Fermentation Processed Colombian coffee. And this one right here was a winner for the Probat, and I actually immediately knew which coffee this one was. As I said in that video, I have a pretty good idea of what this one is. I really enjoy this coffee, as it's one of my favorite coffees that Manhattan has ever released, as it did have a very strong fruit vibrancy to the cup. And once again, the Probat did win because of the vibrancy that was present within it, and I actually had a very strong preference towards the Probat version of this coffee, which is interesting and something I'll probably come back to a little later in this video. All right, we continue on to coffee number 4, which is the Silvio Roberto Anaerobic Natural Processed Brazil. And this one was another winner for the Typhoon, and it won for the reason that I expected the Typhoon coffees to win, and that was the clarity. This one right here was a little bit more clean than the Probat version of this coffee, as I did have a strong preference towards the Typhoon version of it. And once again, as I mentioned with the Luna Bermudez, I'm going to kind of go back to it at the end because I think that there's something really important about this coffee and why it won, as well as why the Luna Bermudez won. Next up, we have coffee number 5, and coffee number 5 is a very interesting one, and this is the second big mistake I made in that video, as this one is the Diego Bermudez Thermal Shock Processed Anaerobic Colombian coffee. And this one right here, I said in that video that I don't think I had ever had this coffee before, and I have had this coffee before. When I did find out it was Diego Bermudez, I felt a little embarrassed by that fact. That being said, it's been almost 3 years since I actually had Diego Bermudez from Manhattan. It's been a very long time, but I remarked in that blind taste test that it had a very similar fruit component to a lot of other coffees, and when I made that comment, I was actually referencing other Diego Bermudez coffees. So I had a feeling that it could possibly be one of the Diego Bermudez coffees, but I said, you know, it doesn't feel as familiar as I might expect one of the Diego Bermudez coffees to feel. Nonetheless, this is the biggest win for the Typhoon in my opinion, because I immediately tried both samples, and while I've loved the Probat sample that I've had in the past, those 3 years ago, I was really impressed by the way the Typhoon version of this coffee came out, as right from the start there was greater clarity and evenness to the cup overall. As a result, there was a very strong preference towards the Typhoon version of this coffee, and I would say the biggest win for the Typhoon in this entire blind taste test. Coffee number 6, the Maria Jose Bueno, the wash processed Ecuador, and this one right here was a winner for the Probat, once again due to the vibrancy. So there was a moderate preference towards the Probat version of this coffee. And a lot of my feedback on this coffee was that it was just a really good coffee. So it didn't matter which version of this coffee it was, whether it be the Probat or the Typhoon. It was just a really nice coffee in general, but the vibrancy pushed this one a little over the top. This one was one of my favorite coffees that I actually tried in that entire video. Coffee number 7, the Wilder Lasso Anaerobic Natural Processed Colombia. And this one right here was another winner for the Typhoon, yet again for a little bit more of a cleaner cup, as there was a moderate preference towards the Typhoon version of this coffee. And I think you're starting to see a pattern when it comes to heavier processed coffees, and that is I preferred the Typhoon for being a little bit more clean. And that's one of the bigger takeaways I'm going to have at the end of the video, is you're going to continue to see that. Heavier processed coffees seem to be doing better with the Typhoon. And that's the case once again with coffee number 8, as it was the Inácio Suarez in anaerobic honey processed Brazilian coffee. And once again with this coffee, the Typhoon did win, this time due to its vibrancy, though I did have a very strong preference towards the Typhoon version of this coffee. So that is one interesting note. It did win because of the opposite reason, not necessarily the clarity, though the clarity did help. Coffee number 8 was another winner for the Typhoon. Coffee number 9, the Rodolfo Rufati, is it Battle, I think, a wash processed El Salvador. And this one right here was a winner for the Probat, and it was very much in line with the sweetness theory I had going into it, and there was a very strong preference towards this version of the coffee, as it did have some great sweetness and great vibrancy to it. So another point in my favor for my theory on the Probat coffees being a little bit more vibrant. We move on to coffee number 10, which is the Shundisa, the natural processed Ethiopia. And once again, the Typhoon is winning due to a little bit more clarity and a fruit-forward finish. This one had a very strong preference towards the Typhoon. And once again, heavier processed coffee is winning on the Typhoon. So nice points right there for Typhoon. And we continue on to coffee number 11, which was the Giku wash processed Burundi coffee. And if I recall correctly, this one was probably one of my least favorite coffees, especially for it being a wash processed coffee. But the Probat did win this one because it was a little less herbal. It didn't have the same sort of kind of unique herbality that was experienced within that coffee. It was a slight preference towards the Probat version. I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of this coffee on either machine, so take that one with what you will. Coffee number 12, a very interesting one. We have the El Paraíso Decaf, a decaffeinated thermal shock wash processed Colombian coffee. And this one right here was a winner for the Probat. And I feel like a lot of people, Zach specifically, were very excited and happy to see me try a decaf coffee. And you probably noticed from my reaction that I could tell that something was just very different about that coffee. And I guess that makes a lot of sense that it was a decaffeinated coffee, because something was just off. It didn't feel like all of the other coffees we had tried up to this point, but given I had no clue what I was trying, I just kind of assumed, okay, Manhattan's experimental, don't really know what to make of this one. But nonetheless, the Probat won because of the finish and a little bit more evenness in the cup. There was a very slight preference towards the Probat version of this coffee, but kind of hard to take too much away from that one, given that it was just a little different from everything else that we had tried. Coffee number 13, the Sweet Valley Natural Processed Colombia coffee. And this one right here is also going against my theory, as the Probat won this coffee, interestingly due to the clarity, as this one came out a little bit more clean, even though this is a slightly more heavily processed coffee, natural processed Colombian coffee, my least favorite type of coffee out there. But there was a very strong preference towards the Probat version of this coffee because of that clarity. That's a very interesting result to me, once again going against my theory. But the final coffee we have is coffee number 14, the Panela Sticky, an anaerobic double fermentation Colombian coffee. And the Probat won this one due to the sweetness and definition, and there was a very strong preference towards the Probat version of this coffee. The final tally on this was 8 for the Probat and 6 for the Typhoon. And my theory going into it wasn't necessarily that I would have a very strong preference towards one machine or the other. If anything, I was fully expecting it to kind of come out this exact way, with 1 or 2 deviations to my theory. For the most part, the heavier processed coffees won with the Typhoon, and the wash processed coffees did win with the Probat, which was in line with my theory and expectations. But what I wanted to go back to was coffee number 3, which was the Luna Bermudez. And that coffee, honestly, is maybe my second or my favorite coffee that I had from this entire blind taste test. And I was really hoping that Lady Bermudez would be included in here, as well as Pepe Hijón, given that those are 2 of my favorite coffees ever. I was very curious to see how they would compare side by side in the Typhoon and the Probat, but I think the best gauge for that was going to be the Luna Bermudez. And what I've said about the Bermudez coffees in the past is even with the more heavily experimental processing that they undergo, they do seem to come out a little bit more clean in general. So given that they're pretty clean coffees to begin with, I don't necessarily think that the Typhoon, maybe making them a little bit more clean, was going to help with them. I was always looking for a little bit more vibrancy, given that they did offer enough clarity to begin with. So that's why my theory is that Luna Bermudez, Letty Bermudez, they would have actually won through the Probat. And I imagine that Pepe also would have won with the Probat. But that's an entirely different coffee, as that one is a Thai or wash. So it's a little bit closer to a wash than it is to a natural or a more heavily processed coffee. So that's kind of my theory with those two, and I wish I would have had an opportunity to try those side by side as well and have those included in this blind taste test. But that's why the Luna Bermudez was a very important one. But there's that list of Typhoon coffees: Silvio Roberto, we have the, my computer keeps shutting down, Ignacio Suarez, the Rodolfo, the Shundisa. All these coffees were winning with the Typhoon, and they were a little bit more heavily processed coffees. So that's the biggest positive I have for the Typhoon, is not only did it win the Diego Bermudez, which was a very big win for them, it won one of the wash processed coffees, the Dubernay Cifuentes, but it also did seem to do a lot better with the more heavily processed coffees. While the wash coffees, for the most part, the coffees that were already pretty clean to begin with, they did really well in the Probat in this. So that did align with my initial theories going into it. So we'll discuss those real quick. First initial theory I had was that you would notice a lot of differences between the two samples, and that actually turned out to be true. Probably the Jansen was the one that had the least amount of differences between the two of them, but there were a couple that had very similar results. But for the most part, I had a very strong preference towards one or the other. So that was very much in line with my theory, but my second theory being that the Probat coffees might be a little bit more vibrant. With the exception of maybe one or two of those, that seems to be the case, while the Typhoon coffees, for the most part as well, did come out a little bit more clean and bright. So that aligned with my theory as well, and I'm actually quite happy with that theory. I'm pretty happy with the way that these results turned out. I mean, it was very much in line with my expectations for it. I think it did prove my theory, but at the end of the day, the biggest thing I had to say was I really enjoyed it, because I still think that Manhattan is one of the best coffee roasters in the entire world. I really enjoy a lot of what they're doing, and none of the samples I had, maybe with the exception of some of the heavier processed coffees and the Burundis, were coffees that I didn't necessarily enjoy. Even the ones that I may have had a strong preference towards the Probat or towards the Typhoon for, I still enjoyed the other samples, at least the ones that were pretty close to it. Of course, I'm thinking of that Maria Jose Bueno, which was one of the more enjoyable ones. That Luna Bermudez as well, it was good roasted on either of the two. So that's kind of to say that even with the change that Manhattan is going to undergo, I still expect that the coffees will be up to Manhattan standards, because they've kind of proven in this blind taste test that they can do a very good job with those same coffees as well. So those are kind of my final reactions to it. I think it did kind of prove my theory a little bit. Me and Ben have discussed it a little bit as well, but I mean, it's going to be an ongoing thing. We're going to continue to see how the coffees turn out, as the Typhoon is going to be the machine predominantly used from this point going forward, and I do expect and believe that they will get the best out of those coffees. So I'm going to leave this at that. If you guys enjoyed this video, then give this one a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. But this right here has been a reaction to our blind taste test video featuring the Probat versus the Typhoon from Manhattan Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.